When you look at the front steps of the Nickelodeon building with its bright colors and SpongeBob SquarePants statue, your mind may not instantly race to Avatar: The Last Airbender, but there is a very unique connection between the two. For the battle between Zuko and Azula by the boat docks, the Avatar team created the choreography and rehearsed it on those very steps before recording the footage and then sending it to their overseas animation department for reference. From there, the footage was then slowly but surely turned into the scene we all know and love. This may all sound pretty unconventional, but the Avatar team have never shied away from doing big and bold things to make the show the best it can be. Avatar is renowned for its beautiful imagery, delicately built world, and clever story arcs, and has become one of the biggest and best shows of all time. For this to happen, a great amount of care, love, and hard work went in behind the scenes to make it the giant hit it is today. In this video, we are going to peek behind the curtain to take a look at what makes this show tick, including its early roots and inspirations, their intrepid animation department, all the way to the insanely detailed choreography. This is behind the scenes of Avatar's animation. When it comes to Avatar, there are many important names attached that helped make it so successful, but none more so than the show's creators, Bryan Michael and Michael DiMartino. Michael and DiMartino met while studying at the Rhode Island School of Design and quickly hit it off due to their common interests. Both were huge fans of big, fantastical properties such as Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, and wanted to build their own world which featured a completely new mythos and lore. They also had a love for Japanese anime, Hong Kong action, and kung fu cinema, and wanted to blend that into a new fantastical property. But there was one man who influenced them more than most: Hayao Miyazaki. The Studio Ghibli co-founder Miyazaki is known for his vivid animation style, which combines soft, artistic backgrounds and vibrant color palettes with simplified yet expressive characters. It is a stunning but difficult style to replicate. But both Michael and DiMartino were determined to bring Miyazaki's influence into their work. With their passion burning, the two moved to Los Angeles, where they got work on shows such as Family Guy, King of the Hill, and Invader Zim. They worked in basically every position in the industry possible, except for the one they wanted the most: lead writer. They both yearned to create their own project, and DiMartino started going around to networks to pitch ideas, but couldn't garner any interest. He quickly became frustrated with the process and planned to call it quits.
I remember Mike being really frustrated and saying, like, that's it, I'm done, I'm not pitching anymore. I was like, forget that, man, we're gonna do it together. Let's do it together. I know we can do it as a team.
As they had their foot in the door at Nickelodeon, they approached them and asked what kind of show concept they were looking for. With the fantasy genre starting to rise heavily in popularity, Nickelodeon told them that they were looking for a bold action-adventure show in a similar vein as Harry Potter, which was magic to the co-creators' ears. So, the two got to work on a show concept, often working late into the night. When Michael went through his old sketchbook, he found two sketches that would later be melded together into one concept. The first was a sketch of an old, balding man shepherding a herd of 20 bison in the sky, which Michael turned into a child. This character would later, of course, turn into Aang. The other was a sci-fi-based monkey with an arrow on his head beside a giant bipedal polar bear. Both sketches would turn into Momo and Appa, respectively. At the same time, DiMartino was working on a documentary that focused on Antarctic explorers who became trapped in the ice, and added this element into the concept. They then came up with the idea of a war between a tribe of water people and fire people who could master their elements, and from there, the idea of the four nations came to be. Never forgetting their primary influence, they also made sure to keep the spiritual feel of Miyazaki's films, such as Princess Mononoke and Spirited Away, and made sure to add it to the world of Avatar. So 2 weeks after they started to come up with the concept of Avatar, they went to Nickelodeon and pitched it. Pitches are notorious for being cutthroat and ruthless, with creators often having very little time to discuss their concept, but Konietzko and DiMartino seemingly broke this trend by effectively rambling on for 3 hours on the show's mythology and world. Nickelodeon's VP of Development, Eric Coleman, even had to cut them short, telling them he was already interested and tasked them with making a pilot. Just like that, Avatar: The Last Airbender was officially in motion. But even though the pitch went smoothly, there were no guarantees Avatar would ever live to see the light of day. And the pilot brought up its own problems. First problem that arose was that they needed an animation team to actually bring the concept to life. It is common practice among a number of US animated shows to outsource the actual animation work, and Avatar was no different. With Miyazaki being such a major influence on them, the duo were eager to work with a Japanese studio on the show. But when their calls were left completely unanswered, the duo soon learned that no Japanese studio had interest in working on the show with them, so they had to eventually turn their sights to other countries in Eastern Asia. They eventually found their partner in the Seoul-based JM Animation, and the Korean company would go on to have a huge impact on the show moving forward. Konietzko and DiMartino wanted to make sure that the company they worked with had a great impact on the show, so they gave JM Animation a great level of artistic license and responsibility. In fact, JM Animation was given a lot more creative involvement than most animated shows out there, and they had freedom to make the changes they wanted.
다른 쇼, 그러니까 아바타 말고 다른 쇼를 많이 했었지만 기존과는 많이 틀리는 어떤 시스템이에요, 아바타가. 그래서 연기자들이 얼마든지 자연스럽게 그리고 뭐 여러 가지 어떤 자료를 보면서 자기 생각을 집어넣을 수 있는 굉장히 많이 그러니까 자유로움이 있어서 그런 것 때문에 도움이 많이 됐고요. 그다음에
But the animators did still have concerns when it came to the pilot. Mainly, they were not sure they could complete it in time due to the complex characters and world. Plus, at this point in time, the duo had some pretty grandiose plans. For example, Aang was supposed to have a herd of 20 bison, but this was then cut down to a small family of them before eventually just being cut down to 1. Their initial vision also had the bison fitted with huge spiral horns, but this was a nightmare to animate, so the design again had to be scaled back. Although their vision was scaled down somewhat, there was still a lot of work to be done. So Konietzko even moved to Seoul for 3 months so he could work closely with the animators, in what Konietzko describes as a very lonely experience.
Just cut off from friends and family, just getting up, getting into the studio at 7 in the morning, working till 10 at night.
But all their hard work emphatically paid off. The pilot went to test screenings and was greatly received by young audiences. On the back of this positive reception, Nickelodeon then ordered 13 episodes of the show, and the ball was now really rolling. Now, for all intents and purposes, we are going to break down the animation sections of the show into 2 categories: acting and animation. Both of these categories use the same fundamental structure, but in rather different ways. Let's start off by talking about the acting scenes. Now, one thing Avatar heavily relied on was reference footage, and it is a key part of the show's production. To really boil it down, reference footage is used in a similar vein as motion capture in VFX, with the animators tracking movements and expressions to make the animation more lifelike. The action heavily relied on reference footage, but as we said, we will get to that later. After the scripts were done, for the acting scenes, Konietzko and DiMartino would often act out the scenes using big, bold movements and expressions that could easily be tracked by the animators. Take, for example, the scene where Momo is in a food coma, which was acted out in reference footage by Konietzko himself. The footage may undoubtedly be pretty funny, but it does serve a very important purpose. One of the things it does is create a bridge over any possible cultural divide between the American creators and the Korean animators. The animators were worried that Korean standards of acting were very different to American standards, but having the reference footage alongside concept drawings, they could understand exactly what was desired. As well as reference footage, Konietzko and DiMartino would also use characters and actors to express their vision. Take, for example, Zhao, who was based off of Jason Isaacs' villain in The Patriot, which actually all turned pretty meta when they got the man himself to play the character. So once the script, storyboards, and reference footage was complete, the production would then move on to the voice acting before the animation. Like Jason Isaacs, DiMartino had someone in mind when it came to casting a voice director and wanted to get the best of the best, and so they hired Andrea Romano, who had worked on great shows such as Batman the Animated Series and SpongeBob SquarePants. In most cases, voice actors don't often work in the same room as one another, and for some actors, that was true for Avatar, but California-based actors Mae Whitman, Jack DeSena, and Dante Brasco, who played Katara, Sokka, and Zuko respectively, would often work in the same room and bounce off one another. The actors would then be given the storyboards and concept drawings to go off of, often providing their own little flourishes and big expressions. Occasionally, the voice actors would be brought in later to make some changes, such as adding occasional sound bites such as groans and exclamations, but for the most part their work was done and the animation was built around their performances. So then it would be the animators' turn to work, and they would take on all the material they had to turn it into the show itself. As we mentioned before, the animators had a great deal of artistic license and creative expression and would make their own changes to the concept art. Instead of matching the dialogue to lip movement, they would instead match it to the expression and emotion of the character. Sokka would often be their favorite to draw, as he would usually provide the more over-the-top performance, while Katara was somewhat more understated. When you think of Avatar, it is almost impossible to not think about the beautiful imagery created, and you would be hard-pressed to say it isn't reminiscent of their main inspiration, Hayao Miyazaki. Like Ghibli, the background paintings are vivid and beautiful while the characters are expressive. The colors pop and the scenery is always immersive. But there are some elements of the animation that were tricky. They were also challenged by the vision of the co-creators, particularly Konietzko, who specifically wanted angles that were tough to draw, as well as wide frames with a great level of space. The way Konietzko saw it is that he wanted it to look as cinematic as possible, so the animators had to adapt to his vision. But another tough element was the action scenes we mentioned earlier. Being a children's show, Nickelodeon were concerned that the amount of fighting would be too bloody, but they found that bending was a good way around that. But Konietzko and DiMartino didn't just want to have some random movements for the action scenes and wanted them to be more grounded in reality. A number of animated shows center around martial arts, but don't actually use any real moves or practices in the animation. Avatar wanted to make sure they didn't do the same, and they wanted to base each move and fighting style after a traditional martial art. To do this though, they needed their own martial arts expert, so Konietzko approached his martial arts teacher, Sifu Kisu, to see if he would be interested. Sifu Kisu is a martial arts expert with 40 years of experience under his belt and has mastered the likes of Taekwondo, Jiu-Jitsu, Karate, and Kung Fu.
I met this kid who's in my class. He started to excel at the techniques, which caught my attention, and talked about this idea he had for a show.
When Konietzko approached Sifu Kisu for the show, he was blown away by how quickly he understood the world and mythology, and Kisu was quick to pitch his own ideas. So Sifu Kisu was officially brought in as their martial arts consultant and would go on to work on all 61 episodes, and he was tasked with creating an individual style of combat for each of the 4 nations. In the end, he based waterbending on Tai Chi, airbending on Bagua, firebending on Northern Shaolin Kung Fu, and earthbending on Hung Ga. Every move you see in the show is based off of a real-life move from each of these different martial arts. For the choreography, like almost every department, Sifu Kisu was given artistic license to create what he thought suited the moment best. The script often left Sifu Kisu with a lot of wiggle room, as it just boiled down the action to its key components. So, after the script was done, Konietzko, Sifu Kisu, and the director would work together, going over the choreography and focusing on what move would work best. Once they would agree on the choreography, they would then record it for reference footage, with Sifu Kisu often acting and recording the choreography of 2 different characters separately. As we mentioned previously, the choreography and fight scenes would often take place at Nickelodeon headquarters itself, whether that be inside or out. Although not every move we see in Avatar is possible to do, seeing as it requires magical qualities and movements that a human could not actually pull off. So to do this, Sifu Kisu would often have to break down the movements into separate fragments, sometimes even pulling people like Konietzko into the move, and have the animators blend them all together when the time came.
And then there's a third session where we really make sure we have it all nailed down, all of the details of the hand positions and the camera angle and any revisions or new ideas. And then that's all edited here and then sent to the animators in Korea.
Animating these pieces still might not have been easy work, but having the reference footage in mind certainly made it easier. And without Sifukisu's involvement, the fighting style of Avatar wouldn't have been as grounded and engaging as it is. Despite the show's amazing success, there was always an endgame in mind, and Konietzko and DiMartino knew when they wanted it to end and were adamant that they would stick to their 3-season storyline. The show may have been immensely popular, but they wouldn't be swayed. The duo had been working 15-hour days for 6, sometimes even 7 days a week for nearly 5 years. They were tired, but also knew that the story would lose its edge if they kept going. So they decided to go out with a bang and made every department up their game for the finale, which they emphatically did. The last 3 episodes were treated as if they were a movie with bigger set pieces, imagery, and music, the culmination of years of hard work. Those final 3 episodes got fans to cheer, cry, and gasp, and it is hard to find any Avatar fan unsatisfied with its ending.
The thing that I remember most was that my wife just kept squeezing my hand tighter, 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 tighter. And she looked over at me and said, "This is the best thing that you've ever been a part of."
But just like that, the show was done. Slightly surprisingly though, Avatar has had somewhat of a second life since emerging on streaming platforms alongside its sister show, Legend of Korra. Avatar's stock continues to rise, and even though M. Night Shyamalan's movie may have been poorly received, adaptations of Avatar are far from done, with Netflix currently working on their own live-action series. Konietzko and DiMartino were originally attached, but have since dropped out of the project. But their involvement with Avatar is far from over, with the launch of Avatar Studios and a number of spin-off shows in the works. What started off as a love of epic fantasies and Hayao Miyazaki turned into one of the biggest shows of all time, up there with the likes of Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad. Its success may seem surprising, but when you look under the surface, it quickly becomes clear why. With its accessible and timeless storyline, beautifully structured mythology, and just the overall love and care put into it. It may be a fantasy series, but it is very much grounded in reality. As we said, Avatar is far from being fully finished, and although it may already be a giant in the industry like Aang in Book 1, it is far from reaching its full potential, and that is very exciting.